Okay, testing. Okay, everyone. So, welcome back to another episode of How to Voice Reposition Chords. This is part of a tutorial series I'm doing to bring the French tradition of learning harmony to an English-speaking audience. So, for my personal story, I struggled with harmony for a very long time. In fact, it took me a very long time to realize that my lack of proper training in harmony was holding me back from larger things. So I did composition in high school, I got conservatory training, then I went to college, undergrad, went through grad school, and I never felt like there was something holding me back. Okay. And then I had a teacher in grad school who kind of introduced me to the true classics, appreciation for Bach and whatnot. And he recognized that there were deficiencies in just the technical training that were holding me back. And I was very, very resistant. And I think a lot of composers get very, very hostile when they're told that after all these years and thousands of dollars in debt, that there's something fundamental missing. And the other thing to recognize is that many times we don't see it because the compositions are excellent, they're interesting, they're innovative, they, excite the public. But what I have seen with a number of major composers, which I'm not going to kind of bash major composers, but there are a number of major composers that are kind of very famous, shall we say, within the classical music world, some who are still alive. And for some reason, why is it that their works in the 70s or the 80s were their best works? Why don't we see a continual progression or even like a, kind of a jumping, going leaps and bounds, right? Why is it with Bach after, obviously with Bach, there's some pieces that are not quite up to snuff from his earlier days. Some of these Latin works just are not quite it. But with Bach, we see this consistency, or maybe we could say certain pieces are better than others, but there's like boom, boom, just especially when we look at the well-tempered clavier, consistent. Within that, you can say maybe this piece is better than that, but we see like a high level of excellence that is sustained, if not gets even stronger. Of course, for me, the B minor Mass by Bach is one of the just the most amazing gems of Western classical literature. But yet we see with a lot of composers that they reach a peak, okay? And then they either stay at that peak or they don't seem to, something happens, okay? And what happens is that they lose something, and that's because they have not really mastered basic harmony. Now, this is very confronting because we go through all these years of training. I know theory, I know this. It is knowledge. But unfortunately, when it comes to composition, when it comes to orchestration, when it comes to fugue, knowledge is valueless. Okay, knowledge, in the brain is great. It's nice, but ultimately, either you can balance a chord or you can't balance a chord. Either you can, voice the harmony for a fugue or you can't. Okay. And these are technical things that you are not able to fake. You cannot study last minute harmony. Harmony is something that you have to get through your fingers. You can only get it by doing. And again, I say this and I know it doesn't sound convincing because we go to the conservatories and they show us and they tell us that somehow it's about the analysis. And this is not the case. So I'm starting to bring this French tradition to a wider speaking public. I had to move to France to get this real training in actual harmony. Took me about 3 to 5 years to really get what I needed, and then I came back to America. But I recognize that not everyone is able to move to France and to get this training. So I want to make a course. There'll be a paid course as well as a public course that I hope to make available in the spring or the summer. So we're continuing with this exercise that we started maybe 2 episodes ago. And one of the features of this exercise, so we have a soprano and we have since figured out the bass. So now we have soprano, and bass. So the hard part in theory has been figured out. And our task is to fill in the middle voices. And notice that I have the Roman numerals. Okay. So our first task is we want to get the cadence. So here's just a reference of where we are. I'll just sing it for you. Re, re, si, la. Okay. And of course, we have this octave leap in the soprano, which is going to cause a lot of problems, but of course, a lot of opportunities to improve. So the half cadence is the five right here. And we need to voice going into it. Why are we trying to voice the half cadence? Because a cadence is a destination point. And when you are voicing chords in harmony, it cannot be that everything is equal. Equality is tyranny when it comes to music. When it comes to music, certain things are more important than other things. And so we have this opening chord that I provided you, and then we have this half cadence right here. So we're going to try to get this half cadence. Okay, so in this first attempt here, notice that we have a wider spacing for the half cadence, the five. Okay, we have a sixth between the soprano and the alto. We also have a sixth between the bass, sorry, between the tenor and the alto. So we have not made this chord as compact as possible. But this is really, really important if you want to do fugue, because sometimes in fugue, the what the destination of every line is going to put you in a wider position, and you have to be able to be comfortable doing this. I've noticed in the French tradition, there tends to be a preference in the answer books for a tighter spacing. But I can tell you from experience, from orchestration especially, this would sound great for brass. You need to be flexible. One other thing I want to mention is notice that this soprano, re, re, si, we're going from a six chord to a four chord. However, usually this soprano would stay on the D, right? Or in theory, we want to move as little as possible when it comes to good voicing. In this example here, I altered the soprano just to show you. So usually you're just going to stay on the same note. But obviously that can create a very boring part. Now, when it comes to a middle voice, that's not so much of a problem because we don't notice the middle voices as much. But the soprano, that's going to be what rests in our ear. And this becomes very, very important when it comes to fugue, because in fugue, granted, there are certain things that are, quote, out of our control. The subject is, or if it's the response, is going to come in every single voice. Okay. So at some point, it's going to be soprano, some it's going to be bass, and the little voices. Same with the counter subject. There's many times the counter subject will not work in the bass. But nevertheless, even though in fugue, our attention should be going to the subject or certain material, it's inevitable that the human ear is going to be aware of these outer intervals, which is why right now we have the bass and the soprano. So let's say we were in a fugue right now and we had the re, re, do, okay, that is what the ear is going to hear. So one of the reasons we work on harmony is so that when you get to fugue, for example, that impulse to create pleasing intervals between the outer voices or pleasing lines is with you, so that the fugue still sounds nice, even if the soprano is doing if you're in a fugue, is doing some kind of accompaniment role. Okay, so now what I want to show you, we talked about how that soprano is kind of leaping unnecessarily. So re, re, si, right? And that's for aesthetic reasons instead of just saying on this D. But when a soprano leaps unnecessarily, the other voices can't just move to their closest note, right? We talk a lot about the path of least resistance. So whenever possible, you want to stay in the same note, which is what the alto is doing right here, B flat, B flat. Then you want to move by step, And then if you can't move by step, then finally you're going to leap. But because the soprano is not following this general tendency, which is not its prerogative, right? The goal of the soprano is to please the ear. It's like the featured dancer. So sometimes the soprano is not going to be going to its closest note, and therefore the inner voices are going to have to make some adjustments. In this case here, because the alto is not making an adjustment, we have an interval that's not allowed in basic harmony studies, okay? It's an augmented second, and I cannot think of a firm good reason why this is not allowed, except it's just not good voice leading. Okay. It's just not part of the practices of the time period. And perhaps in your own music, you will like this, but keep in mind that this will also sound like a third, even though it's written as a second. But nevertheless, this interval is not allowed. In addition, you'll remember that one of the rules that we have for reposition chords is that when the bass moves by a second, so we're going from a G to an a 4 chord to a 5 chord, the other voices need to move in opposite direction. The first time I was presented this information in France, it was like, shockwaves hitting me because so many years I struggled, I drowned trying to learn harmony in America. And of course, in America, the way they teach harmony is they give you a Bach chorale and you have to, that's so complicated. A Bach chorale is incredibly difficult because you're going to have passing tones and you have key changes. So the beauty of the French tradition is they make it so simple. Now, it's not necessarily easy, but they break it down so you can actually learn the building blocks. So one of the things we learn is when the bass is moving by a second, the only way you can voice it properly is the other voices have to move in opposite direction. Of course, we have that notorious, and you cannot forget, exception for the deceptive cadence in which a leading tone goes up. But otherwise, you're going to have to move in opposite direction. Here is an example of why. Because if we have the alto going up, it's going to have to do an augmented second. So, but we can't have the alto going down here because then we're going to have parallel octaves, B flat A, right? So when you come across something awkward like this, then it's probably an indication that you have made a poor decision. Okay, so in our current voicing, notice that we have soprano and bass leaping in the same direction. This is something we really, really, really try to avoid because one of the principles in harmony are the separation of powers. So the bass is its own region, and then the upper three voices work together, and soprano is kind of the leader. And we really like this separation because it makes it just much easier to understand the music. It also pops more. For example, in orchestration, you want to have a really clear bass line. So in this, we see it really clearly, right? It's D, B flat, G, A. So if I were to orchestrate this, okay, let's say for, I don't know, strings or whatever, you were probably going to double, right? You're going to put this line up the octave, the F, this tenor line might go up another octave. You're going to do, so you have a fuller register, right? Okay, maybe you want full orchestra, you want this to be 2 octaves higher. But at no point are you going to mix this bass. So this bass here is always going to be kind of the last say. It's its own, it's like I don't know, I think in Game of Thrones or something where there's the iron wall. I don't know. But you get what I mean. It's the last say, and you don't want to mix the different parts. Okay. So this again is why a lot of problems that you're going to have when you orchestrate are going to be harmonic in nature. And the sooner that you can just start addressing it in harmony, the better. Okay, so we didn't like that the fact that the bass was leaping in the same direction as the soprano. So here I tried. having the bass instead of leaping down to the G, leaping up to the G. But notice that it just creates a kind of windy line. Re, si, sol. I lost my pitch, but re, si, la, re, si, sol, la. Okay. Notice how it kind of goes down, it goes up. It's just not a really clear bass line. Okay. Now, another thing you need to think about is let's say you did change that. Okay. What happens now if you don't address what comes afterwards? Notice that we have the bass in a medium range and then we have it in a low range. So one of the things that you have to do in Fugue, right, is you make one micro change in one measure, and then 10 measures later you have to make a change. Because part of the aesthetics of Fugue is that mirror or that symmetry, right? So you have the counter subject and you have the subject, and maybe you have another some filler, and then later in the fugue you reverse the voices. So the counter subject goes to the bass, or all kinds of mixing and matching, different keys. But if you make a change in one of those measures, then you want that symmetry preserved later in the fugue or early in the fugue. But likewise, in harmony studies, that root idea of kind of like symmetry or rather consistency is already present. So let's say if you obviously had to have this medium range, you would need to adjust this later. That's probably not going to work because sorry, let me go back. Notice here that the soprano is on E. So if we were to put the bass up an octave, it's only going to be a fifth difference separation from the bass to soprano. That's incredibly compact. So you see, even though root position chords seems simple, it's actually really, really difficult because every change has global consequences. Now, suppose you wanted a better bass line, okay? Notice here that the bass is leaping in the same direction as the soprano. Re, re, si, la. Oh my goodness, let me go back. Okay, so re, re, si, la. Okay, and then the bass is doing re, si, sol, la. Okay, and these are very controversial leaps, right? An octave leap on paper, and especially on a piano, you may not feel like anything's changed, but keep in mind that this is vocal music, right? Classical music is coming out of the Catholic Church, and it was a cappella, okay? And harmony studies is coming from a vocal perspective. So something like this, it's an energetic shift. It's going to get a lot louder. So having the bass leap a six at the same time that soprano is leaping an eighth, this feels like musically it's going to be really nice, but we've lost the separation of powers, and right now we're focused on a convention. So this definitely it cannot possibly be the only possible solution. Okay, so in French we have this thing called les tolerances, and sometimes I admit I think more in French instead of English, so I don't know if this word works exactly in English. But basically, we have certain rules or des conseils. Okay, so we have certain ideas, certain values that we have, like the fact we want the bass and soprano leaping in opposite direction if they're going to leap, not in the same direction. But sometimes, it just becomes a tyranny because you're so focused on the rules that you can't actually complete the exercise. So in this particular case, it may be that we have to allow them to leap in the same direction. It's very brief. They're a third. No one's going to die, but it's definitely not the ideal. But it is more acceptable than this version where they're leaping up, which is more noticeable, and it's these very large intervals. This is also where harmony studies get very difficult. okay, or where I think people may start to give up, because everyone likes it when there's certainty, like there's rules, right? No parallel fifths, great, okay? There's no gray area, it's never allowed, okay? So it's great. But then there's other things in harmony where it's a general rule, but then you have to understand which is more important. Okay, now, so the original solution that we had, we were trying to get to the half cadence. Notice, however, that we have an octave plus a third, so a tenth between the alto and the soprano. This is not acceptable in a harmony exercise because keep in mind that this is vocal music, okay? Even if you're going to be composing string orchestra music or brass or whatever you want to do, and you don't want to do vocal, but music, classical music, is coming from the vocal. Okay, so that is the root, that is the center, and everything is coming from this vocal music. So this tense is going to be way too large. It's going to feel like something's missing in the music. So let's say you were writing for orchestra or you had more voices, then you might do a five voice solution, right? So notice we have this middle re, re, si, la, okay? And then here we kept a soprano at first at the unison, so we don't notice that there's an additional voice, but now it just stays on this D for as long as possible and descends, and it's providing this additional voice. Okay, we have the bass, of course, we have the tenor. Here, the tenor is in the bass clef for this representation, just so you know. And then we have the alto. This is at five voices at first, but then notice here, si la, si la. Okay, we have the soprano doing B flat to A, and then we have the alto doing B flat to A. In a pure harmony studies class, that is parallel octaves. Okay, it's parallel octaves. But in orchestrational concept class or context, it's not parallel octave, it's a doubling. And I mentioned this, I want to see if I have the score. I can't find it. Oh yeah. So I have I don't know how well it shows up on the screen, but I have a score for the Mussorgsky's um, pictures and exhibition, but the Ravel transcription. And there's also, in this particular version, there's a piano reduction, which is really great for orchestration. And what you'll see both in the piano reduction as well as in the realization for the orchestra, that it goes from six voices to seven voices to eight voices to six voices to five voices. In an orchestrational context, we're going to go in and out of five voices and four voices because music is much more flexible, okay, depending on what the needs are for the balance. However, when it comes to harmony studies, we're only going to have four voices because we want the kind of purest form possible. So therefore, this solution here, even though it worked really nicely, it's just not going to be possible because we only have four voices available. That's also why harmony really strengthens you because it is so ridiculously difficult in terms of like what you're allowed to do that it really brings out the best in you. So we need to fill in this octave leap in the soprano. I challenge you to figure it out. I've already figured out probably only one good solution. I would say this is something really controversial, an octave leap like this. So you have to be willing to maybe bend one of the rules that aren't absolute, but that takes a little risk. So if you want to do the exercise, then I still have it posted on my website. And then hopefully in the next episode, I will show you what the answer is. Thank you so much for watching, and I wish you the best of luck with your harmony. Have a good day.